Hello my dear viewers, thank you so much for watching our channel. Please subscribe, leave a like and hit the bell for more videos. He had everything most people could only dream of. Money flowed into his life like a river without end, a fortune he had inherited too young, too soon, and with too little preparation for what it really meant. To him, the numbers in his bank account were not security, nor legacy, nor responsibility. They were fuel. Fuel for the nights where the city lights blurred past him, where engines roared louder than reason, where his heart only seemed alive when danger flirted with him on the open road. His name echoed in society columns and magazines, always accompanied by words like reckless, daring, charming troublemaker. The world admired him not for kindness or discipline, but for the image he had built. A young millionaire who seemed untouchable, handsome in a way that demanded attention, and wild in a way that made people talk. His sports car, a gleaming machine the color of fire at dusk, was not just a possession. It was his signature, his crown, his weapon of escape. Wherever that car appeared, people knew he wasn't far behind, chasing something invisible, something no one else could name. But the truth was simpler. He was addicted. To speed, to noise, to the illusion that the faster he went, the less he had to feel. Money couldn't fill the silence inside his home. The mansion, with its marble floors and panoramic views, echoed emptiness when the parties ended. The glasses of champagne were distractions, the laughter of strangers temporary cures, the endless nights on the road his only form of prayer. While others envied him, he felt like a man drowning in luxury, searching for air in the rush of adrenaline. It had all started years ago when he was still a boy. His father had loved cars, not just for their price tags but for the freedom they represented. He remembered sitting in the passenger seat as a child, the smell of leather, the vibration of the engine through the floor, and his father's voice telling him, "Out here, son, nothing can stop you." When his father was gone, the cars remained, ghosts of moments that would never return. And so, driving became more than a passion. It was a way to bring back someone he missed, someone whose absence he could never outrun. But nostalgia twisted into obsession. By the time he was old enough to inherit his empire, he was already known for racing through the city streets, ignoring traffic lights, daring anyone to stop him. No fine was too heavy, no risk too great. The roads were his battlefield, and speed was his declaration of existence. Every time the engine roared, he felt alive. Every time the tires screamed against asphalt, he silenced the doubts in his mind. Every time someone called him reckless, he thought, "Yes, but at least I'm not invisible. At least I'm..." People watched him like a spectacle. Crowds gathered at underground races where he appeared like a king among rebels. Cameras followed him at charity galas where he arrived with his car polished like a jewel, his suit as sharp as his smile. He had friends, or what looked like friends, men who wanted to bask in his shadow, women who wanted to taste the danger he carried like cologne. But in truth, most of them weren't there for him. They were there for the money, the glamour, the thrill of being close to someone who lived without fear. Yet beneath the noise and chaos, he sometimes wondered if anyone really saw him. Not the image, not the speed, not the fortune. Him, the boy who once looked up to his father, who once thought love could last forever, who once believed there was more to life than engines and endless nights. But such thoughts were fleeting. Every time they surfaced, he drowned them again in gasoline and fire. There was one place, however, where even he could not escape himself. The quiet moments before a race when the helmet was in his hands and the world was holding its breath. In those seconds, when the crowd was waiting and the engines were idling, he would feel something unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of death, but fear of life. Fear of what it meant if the race ended and nothing changed. Fear of what he might see in the silence if he ever chose to stop. He never admitted this to anyone. Not to his so-called friends, not to the women who smiled at him across champagne glasses, not even to the reflection in the mirror. To the world, he was unshakable, untouchable, the millionaire behind the wheel, the man who outran everything. But the truth was that he was being chased not by the police, not by rivals, not by fate, but by himself. And one night, Under the glow of the city's neon veins, as engines screamed and the race began, destiny tightened its grip on him. The world would soon discover that no fortune, no car, no speed could shield a man from the moment when everything changes. A crash was coming, not just of metal and glass, but of a life colliding with a new beginning, because the universe had plans for him. Plans that involved a woman he had never met, a woman whose strength came not from wealth or speed, but from courage and compassion, a woman who would remind him that the heart is not moved by horsepower, but by something infinitely more dangerous: love. And so his story begins not at the finish line of a race, but in the shadows of who he was before everything broke. The millionaire behind the wheel, the boy searching for meaning, the man who had everything and nothing at all. The night air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that vibrated in the chest like the hum of an engine before ignition. The city had a way of holding its breath when he appeared. Word traveled fast in the underground racing circuit, whispers in bars, coded messages in dimly lit garages, subtle nods exchanged between men who lived for the adrenaline of danger. Tonight was no different. The crowd gathered along the hidden stretch of road, headlights cutting through the dark like watchful eyes waiting for the king of speed to arrive. And then they heard it, the low growl of an engine that was more animal than machine. His car appeared like fire slicing through shadow, its body gleaming as if even the night itself couldn't hide it. The young millionaire stepped out, helmet in hand, leather jacket fitting him like armor, his expression carrying that dangerous mix of arrogance and charm that made people whisper his name even before he said a word. He didn't need to announce himself. The car did it for him. The race that night wasn't just another thrill. It was a challenge, a rival, someone who had been waiting, training, promising that this would be the night the legend would fall. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the promise of speed, the risk of wreckage, the unspoken truth that tonight could end in glory or disaster. But for him, disaster was never a thought worth entertaining. He was invincible, or so he believed. Engines revved, tires screeched against the pavement as drivers prepared for the signal. The crowd roared like a storm, their voices blending into one chaotic symphony. He slid into the driver's seat, fingers tightening on the wheel, heartbeat syncing with the machine. For a moment, everything else fell silent. No fortune, no emptiness, no ghosts of the past. Just him, the car, and the road that stretched like a promise into the darkness. The flag dropped. Engines screamed. The world blurred. Buildings melted into streaks of light. Street signs vanished in flashes. The city itself seemed to bend and twist, as if trying to keep up with them. He was alive, truly alive, as the speedometer climbed higher and higher, his rival's headlights a taunt in the corner of his vision. The race was chaos, horns blaring, tires spitting sparks, turns taken too sharp, metal trembling against the laws of physics. For the crowd, it was a spectacle. For him, it was oxygen. Every second was proof that he still existed, proof that nothing could cage him. His rival closed in, the two cars neck and neck, engines howling like beasts fighting for dominance. He smirked, confident, reckless, certain that victory was already his. But fate has a way of humbling even the untouchable. The turn came too fast, a slick patch of road barely visible under the weak glow of a broken streetlight. His tires caught it, sliding, losing grip. In that fraction of a second, everything unraveled. The car spun, momentum tearing it from his control. He fought the wheel, but the machine betrayed him, skidding sideways, metal screaming as it kissed the guardrail. And then came the impact. The world exploded in glass and fire. The sound was deafening, a shattering symphony of twisted steel, breaking bones, and the roar of destruction. Time slowed, cruel and deliberate, as if the universe wanted him to feel every fragment of the moment. The windshield shattered into diamonds that cut the night. His body lurched, pain stabbing like knives through every nerve. The car flipped, once, twice, the world outside spinning in violent chaos before everything went black. Silence followed, a silence so heavy it felt eternal. The crowd gasped, screams echoing, but no one dared to rush forward. For all his recklessness, no one wanted to touch the fallen king of speed. Sirens wailed in the distance, sharp and urgent, but it wasn't the official paramedics who arrived first. It was a trainee, a young woman barely past her exams, thrust into the chaos with trembling hands but an unshakable will. She ran to the wreckage, her breath sharp in the cold night air, heart pounding not from fear but from determination. This was her moment, the one she had trained for, the one she had dreamed about in classrooms and simulation labs. She wasn't supposed to be here, not yet, not in the middle of a street race gone wrong, but fate had written her name into this story. She forced the door open, glass cutting her gloves, smoke choking her lungs. And there he was, the millionaire who had seemed so untouchable, now broken, blood painting his forehead, breath shallow, life hanging by the thinnest thread. For a second, she froze. Not because of who he was, but because of how fragile he suddenly appeared. The man who had outrun everything now looked like a boy who had lost control. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. Her hands moved quickly, checking his pulse, stabilizing his neck, calling out instructions she had memorized 100 times. The world around her disappeared, the screams, the flashing lights, the chaos of the race. All that mattered was keeping his heart beating, keeping his lungs working, refusing to let death steal him in the night. And in the haze of his pain, he opened his eyes. Just for a moment. He saw her, not the uniform, not the training, not the fear hidden in her determination, but her eyes. Eyes that didn't look at him like a millionaire, or a reckless driver, or a spectacle. Eyes that looked at him like he was a life worth saving. It was only a second before he slipped back into unconsciousness, but it was enough. Enough to leave an imprint, like a flame in the dark. Enough to change everything. By the time the ambulance arrived, she had already done what most thought impossible. She had kept him alive. She had pulled him back from the edge. The king of speed, the millionaire behind the wheel, the untouchable man, had been saved not by luck, not by money, not by his own strength, but by her. A trainee paramedic who had never once been in the spotlight, who had no idea that tonight her life had collided with his in a way neither of them could ever escape. The night of the accident wasn't just the end of his reckless reign. It was the beginning of a story neither of them saw coming. A story not of speed, but of something far more dangerous. A story of promises yet to be made. Hospitals have a way of humbling even the strongest souls. The walls are too white, the lights too bright, the silence too heavy. For a man who had lived his entire life at full throttle, where every second was consumed by noise and motion, waking up in a sterile room felt like waking up inside a cage. At first, he didn't even remember what had happened. He opened his eyes to a ceiling he didn't recognize, the smell of antiseptic filling his lungs, the dull ache of pain wrapped around his body like chains. Machines beeped beside him, keeping rhythm with a heart that felt strangely foreign. He moved his hand, slow and trembling, only to feel the tug of wires, the sting of bruises, the reminder that he was no longer in control. Then it returned, the memory of headlights, the scream of tires, the violent spin of the world before everything went black. The race, the crash, the moment his invincibility shattered into glass across the asphalt. He should have been dead. By all logic, by the laws of physics and fate, that night should have been his last. But it wasn't. And the reason sat quietly in the corner of the room, her presence soft but steady, like a shadow that refused to leave. She wasn't supposed to be there. Trainees didn't usually stay with patients after the ambulance ride, but something about him had anchored her. She told herself it was professional, that she wanted to make sure he was stable, that she needed to see the outcome of her first true emergency. But deep down she knew there was more. Something had shifted the moment she looked into his eyes at the crash site. Something that kept her from walking away. He noticed her before he spoke. Her posture, straight but tense. The way she held a notebook in her hands, though she hadn't written a word in hours. The way her eyes lifted to him, cautious, as if unsure whether she should meet his gaze. "You!" His voice was rough, broken, a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You're the one who pulled me out." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I was there." There was no arrogance in his tone this time, no smugness, no performance, just rawness, gratitude laced with confusion, like a man who couldn't understand why fate had chosen to spare him. "Why?" he asked. Why risk it? You could have... He stopped, wincing at the sharp ache in his chest. Her voice was calm, almost tender, but firm in its conviction. Because that's what I'm here for, to save lives, even reckless ones. The words stung, but not because they were harsh, because they were true. For the first time, someone had spoken to him without awe, without fear, without wanting something in return. She didn't care that he was a millionaire, or that his face had been plastered across magazines, or that his name carried weight. To her, he was just a man, broken, fragile, human. And in that realization, something inside him shifted. Days passed in a rhythm he wasn't used to. Instead of roaring engines and flashing lights, there were quiet mornings interrupted only by nurses checking his vitals. Instead of the chaos of parties and races, there was the steady hum of hospital machines. And instead of empty laughter, there was her, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking softly, but always there. He found himself waiting for her visits. He never admitted it aloud, not even to himself, but his eyes searched for her the moment the door opened. She was different from anyone he had ever known. No pretenses, no games. Her hair often tied back in a messy bun, her uniform a little too big for her frame, her hands always busy, yet her presence carried more weight than any crowd he had ever performed for. She talked to him, not about his wealth, not about his cars, not about the accident, but about life, about her training, her long nights of studying, her dreams of one day becoming a full paramedic, maybe even more. She spoke with a quiet passion, a sincerity that disarmed him. And for the first time in years, he listened, really listened. He started to notice the details, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about saving lives, the way her laughter softened the sterile air of the hospital room, the way she never treated him as fragile, even when his body still bore the bruises of his mistakes. To her, he wasn't a millionaire to be impressed by, nor a reckless man to be scolded. He was simply a person, worthy of being seen. And slowly, against his will, his heart began to race, not with adrenaline, not with speed, but with something far more dangerous. It was subtle at first, the way he felt lighter when she entered the room, the way he caught himself wanting to say something funny just to hear her laugh, the way his chest tightened, not with pain but with something unexplainable, when she smiled at him. He didn't understand it. He had known countless women, models, actresses, socialites who clung to his arm like accessories, but none of them had ever made his heart feel this way. None of them had made him forget the world outside, forget the emptiness, forget the ghosts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline and painted the hospital room in shades of gold, he found himself speaking words he hadn't planned. "Do you believe people can change?" he asked suddenly. She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she said after a pause, "but only if they want to. Change isn't about promises. It's about choices." The simplicity of her answer struck him harder than any crash. He realized then that he had been living without choices, letting speed and recklessness dictate his path. But here she was, offering him something different. Not forgiveness, not pity, but the possibility of change. And for the first time in his life, he wanted it. Not for his fortune, not for his reputation, not even for himself. But because when she looked at him, he wanted to be the man she believed he could be. The heartbeat that had once lived only for speed now beat for something else, for someone else. And he knew deep in the silence of that hospital room that his life would never be the same again, because speed could thrill, adrenaline could distract, but love was the only force powerful enough to truly set him free. Recovery was not a straight line. For him, it was a battle between pride and vulnerability, between the man he had been and the man he was slowly becoming. Each morning began with stiffness in his body, a reminder of the crash that had almost ended everything. Each night ended with thoughts he couldn't control, thoughts of her, the paramedic trainee who had been at his side more often than anyone else. She didn't belong to his world, and he knew it. Her life was carved from discipline, study, and sacrifice, while his had been built on indulgence, recklessness, and the luxury of never needing to think twice. She took buses and walked home under streetlights after long shifts. He had limousines waiting at every corner, chauffeurs who bowed when he entered. She saved lives, he endangered his own. Everything about them should have been incompatible. And yet the more time he spent with her, the more he felt the walls of his world begin to crack. When he was discharged from the hospital, he expected her presence in his life to end. She had done her part, saved him, cared for him, watched over his fragile days of recovery. He thought that once the white walls and beeping monitors disappeared, so would she. But fate had other plans. The first time he saw her outside the hospital, it was by accident. He had gone to a cafe, something he rarely did, preferring exclusive lounges where his name guaranteed privacy. But that day, he wanted something different, something ordinary. And there she was, sitting at a corner table, textbook spread before her, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her notes. She didn't see him at first. She was too lost in her studying, her lips silently mouthing medical terms, her brow furrowed in concentration. He stood there longer than he should have, caught in the simplicity of the scene. She was not dressed in a uniform this time, no gloves, no professional mask. Just a young woman chasing her dream with everything she had, unaware that someone was watching her like she was the most extraordinary sight in the world. When she finally looked up and noticed him, surprise widened her eyes. What are you doing here?" she asked, half startled, half amused. He shrugged, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. "Maybe I needed coffee, or maybe I needed to see if you exist outside of hospitals." Her laugh was soft, genuine. It disarmed him. Unlike the practiced giggles he was used to, her laughter was real, and it struck him like a melody he wanted to hear again and again. That night marked the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated. He started seeking excuses to see her, to appear in the ordinary spaces of her world, cafes, public libraries, even quiet walks in the park after her shifts ended. For a man who had lived surrounded by noise and flashing lights, these simple moments felt strangely intoxicating, but the differences between them were undeniable. In her small apartment, books stacked on shelves that sagged under their weight, he felt out of place. He was used to marble floors and chandeliers, not second-hand furniture and mugs with chipped edges. And yet, her world had warmth his mansion lacked. The smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the comfort of a blanket folded neatly on the couch, the sound of laughter echoing against walls that held stories, not emptiness. In his world, she often felt overwhelmed. Grand entrances, glittering parties, cameras flashing like lightning storms, people whispering his name as though he were both idol and scandal. She stood beside him in these places with quiet strength, but he saw the discomfort in her eyes. She didn't belong to this stage of superficiality, and he hated that his presence dragged her into it. And yet, despite these contrasts, they kept finding each other. The differences that should have torn them apart only deepened the pull between them. He admired her discipline, her compassion, her refusal to be impressed by wealth. She admired his vulnerability, the glimpses of the man he was becoming when he let his guard down. One evening, they found themselves walking along the riverbank, the city lights shimmering across the water. He had cancelled a meeting, something his assistant would surely scold him for, just to be here. She carried her backpack, heavy with books, yet she walked lightly as though her burdens didn't weigh her down. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I used to think the only thing worth chasing was speed. The rush, the danger, it made me feel alive. But now—" He paused, searching her face. "Now I wonder if I was just running away." Her gaze softened, the river's reflection dancing in her eyes. "Maybe you were," she said gently. "But sometimes it takes losing control to realize what really matters." Her words hit him with the force of truth, and in that moment he knew he wasn't chasing speed anymore. He was chasing her, not with the desperation of a man trying to escape, but with the hope of a man finally running towards something worth having. But love between two worlds was never simple. His friends questioned him, mocking the idea of a millionaire falling for a trainee. Her colleagues warned her to be careful, to guard her heart against a man with a reputation for recklessness. Even his own family, bound by pride and legacy, whispered that she wasn't suitable, that she didn't belong in the polished photographs of their lineage. Yet when they looked at each other, none of that mattered. The world could divide them with wealth, status, and expectations, but it couldn't deny the undeniable truth. Their hearts had found a rhythm that existed beyond those boundaries. He was wealth and risk. She was compassion and perseverance, two lives that should have run parallel, never intersecting. And yet, fate had drawn their lines together in the unlikeliest of places, between a crash and a promise. And as they stood on that riverbank, the night air carrying the sound of the city's heartbeat, they both understood something neither had dared to say aloud. They didn't just want each other, they needed each other, worlds apart, yet drawn together. Change had never been part of his vocabulary. For years he had been defined by excess, recklessness, and a refusal to listen to anyone who told him to slow down. But love has a way of dismantling the strongest walls, of exposing the cracks in even the most impenetrable armor. And now when he looked at her, he saw not just the woman who had saved his life, but the woman who had saved him from himself. Yet wanting to change and becoming someone new were two different battles. The days following his recovery were filled with temptation. The same friends who had cheered him on at races called him again, inviting him back into the chaos. Expensive cars waited in his garage, polished and gleaming, their engines begging to be unleashed. The newspapers speculated endlessly about when he would return to the nightlife, the scandals, the speed. The world expected him to remain exactly who he had always been, the reckless young millionaire who couldn't be tamed. But she expected something else. She didn't demand it, didn't threaten him, didn't even speak it aloud. She simply lived in a way that showed him what was possible. She chose discipline over shortcuts, compassion over selfishness, purpose over distractions. And by her example, he began to realize that the only proof of love worth giving was not words, not gifts, not grand gestures, but change. The first test came sooner than he thought. One evening, he was invited to an underground race, an event that once would have ignited his blood with excitement. His rivals whispered that his absence had made him weak, that his crown was slipping, that he had lost the edge that once made him untouchable. The temptation was unbearable. His pride screamed for him to go, to prove them wrong, to show the world that he was still the king of speed. But then he thought of her, of the way she had looked at him when he lay broken on the asphalt, of the way her voice had commanded him to stay alive, of the way her presence had taught him that worth was not measured in horsepower, but in choices. So he didn't go. For the first time in years, he ignored the call of the race. Instead, he spent the evening walking with her, their steps in sync beneath the glow of street lamps. He didn't tell her what he had turned down to be there. He didn't need to. Her smile as she listened to him speak about his father, about his past, about the man he hoped to become, that was enough. But change was not just about refusing old habits. It was about building new ones. He began pouring energy into places he had once neglected. He invested in medical training programs, quietly funding scholarships for young paramedics like her. He sat in meetings not just as a bored heir, but as a man genuinely interested in the legacy his father had left him. He started showing up for people who had once been invisible to him, workers, drivers, assistants, listening to their stories, their struggles, their lives. And she noticed. One night, as they sat together on the balcony of his penthouse, the city sprawling below them, she turned to him and asked softly, "Why are you doing all this?" His gaze lingered on the skyline, then shifted to her. "Because for the first time, I want to be someone I can be proud of. Someone you can be proud of." Her eyes softened, and though she didn't speak immediately, the way she reached for his hand told him more than words ever could. Still, doubt haunted him. Could he really sustain this change? Or was it just another thrill, another challenge to conquer? The answer came in the form of another temptation. One of his oldest friends, more like a rival than a companion, showed up unannounced with keys to a brand new car, a machine that promised impossible speeds. "Come on," his friend taunted. "One last race, for old time's sake." The old him would have said yes without hesitation. The old him would have smirked, taken the keys, and disappeared into the night. But the man sitting across from that friend wasn't the same anymore. He looked at the car, then back at the woman who had taught him what mattered, and he shook his head. "No," he said, the word carrying the weight of a promise. "I've already had my last race." It was not just a refusal. It was a vow, to her to himself, to the life he wanted to build. And from that night forward, he carried that promise like a shield. Each day he chose her. Each day he chose change. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to honor the love that had saved him. Love, he realized, was not just about feeling. It was about transformation, about becoming the person someone else believed you could be, about slowing down, not because you had to, but because what you had found was worth protecting. And as he held her hand beneath the stars, he whispered words he had never spoken to anyone before. I can't promise you perfection, but I can promise you this. I'll never stop trying to be the man you saw in me when you saved my life. That was the true promise of change. The night was quiet, too quiet for a man who had once lived by the roar of engines and the blur of neon lights rushing past his windows. For years, his heartbeat had matched the pulse of the racetrack, every breath caught between danger and euphoria. Yet now, as he stood on the balcony of the university library, an unlikely sanctuary for a man who once believed books were cages instead of doors, he found a different kind of rush. Not from speed, not from recklessness, but from her hand brushing lightly against his. It had been months since the accident, months since the universe had brought their worlds crashing together in that instant of twisted metal and flashing lights. And in those months, he had been forced to confront truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. That wealth could not buy meaning, that power could not replace connection, that speed could not outrun emptiness, and that love, once found, could not be ignored. But love did not erase the tension that still lingered between the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. Every day was a negotiation between past and future. His garages, once filled with trophies of adrenaline, still whispered his name. His friends, those shadows of his former life, still called him, tempting him back with promises of glory. And deep down, a part of him still wondered if he could really leave it all behind, or if he was simply pretending. She never pressured him. That was her gift. She never demanded his transformation, never issued ultimatums. She simply lived beside him, her quiet strength shining brighter than any raceway floodlights. She asked nothing except honesty, and in her presence he discovered a freedom he had never known, the freedom to be flawed, to stumble, to try again, and yet the world around them refused to stay silent. Rumors spread across the university like wildfire. The heir of one of the nation's greatest fortunes, walking hand in hand with a girl who spent her nights studying instead of attending galas. Whispers filled classrooms, cafeterias, and dorm hallways. Some called her lucky, others called her a distraction. Some doubted it would last, and more than one rival wondered what it would take to make him stumble. But the biggest test of their love did not come from jealous classmates or gossip. It came from the ghosts of his own choices. One evening, an invitation arrived in an envelope thick with arrogance. The Underground Racing League, his old kingdom, was hosting an event. Not just any event, the Race of Kings, a once-in-a-decade gathering where only the best dared compete. To refuse was to admit defeat. To accept was to risk everything. He held the envelope in his hand for hours, the gold lettering glinting in the dim light of his penthouse. His pride screamed at him to go. His past whispered that he owed it to himself, to prove he was still the legend they remembered. His pulse quickened, that old hunger stirring once more. But then he looked across the room where she sat curled up on the couch, her hair falling softly across her face as she read. She was unaware of the storm raging inside him, and in that moment, he realized the truth. The real race wasn't out there on the track. The real race was here, in this life they were building together, and the finish line wasn't victory, it was love. He tore the invitation in half. Yet fate has a cruel sense of humor, for even as he chose love over recklessness, the world refused to let him walk away quietly. His rival, the one man who had always chased him, who had never been able to beat him on the track, showed up at the university. With venom in his eyes and envy in his heart, he confronted him in the courtyard. "You think you can just walk away?" the rival sneered. "You think you can quit before I've had my chance to beat you? No. You owe me one last race." The students gathered, whispering, filming with their phones, hungry for drama. The old him would have smiled at the challenge, reveled in the attention, fueled by the cheers and the danger. But now, standing there with her at his side, he saw clearly. He owed his rival nothing. He owed the crowd nothing. The only person he owed anything to was the woman who had taught him the meaning of promise. And so instead of accepting the challenge, he did something no one expected. He reached for her hand, laced his fingers with hers, and walked away. The rival shouted after him, furious, humiliated, but he didn't turn back. For the first time in his life, he understood that true victory wasn't about crossing a finish line. It was about knowing which races weren't worth running. That night, as they walked along the quiet streets beyond campus, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, he stopped suddenly. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of the words he had carried for too long. "I spent my whole life running," he confessed, his voice raw. "Running from expectations, from responsibility, from myself. And when I met you, I thought you were just another moment, another distraction. But you weren't. You were the first reason I ever wanted to stop running. You were the first person I wanted to slow down for, and now I don't just want to change for you, I want to change with you." Her eyes shimmered as she looked up at him, the world falling away until there was only the two of them. And then, in the silence between their heartbeats, he made his final promise. "I don't need races anymore. I don't need trophies or headlines or rivals. I just need you. If you'll let me, I want to build a future with you, not the kind written in newspapers or whispered in gossip halls, but one written in the everyday, in morning coffees, in quiet walks, in nights like this. That's the only finish line I want to cross." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached up, placed her hands gently on his face and kissed him. A kiss that wasn't just love, it was acceptance. A kiss that wasn't just hope, it was belief. And in that moment, the man who had once lived at full speed finally understood what it meant to arrive. Because love was the only race worth running, and she was the only prize he would ever need.